How far does an injured player like AJ Green have to fall before you're interested in taking him? And how soon should you take Austin Ekeler or Justin Jackson with Melvin Gordon holding out? We'll answer those questions and more in part 3 of this special Football Guys Power Grid trilogy. I'm Austin Lee, and I'm joined by David Dodds, Dan Hindrey, and James Brimacombe, and we're talking about best ball tournaments at draft.com. If you missed our first 2 episodes, be sure to check those out. But in this episode, we're going to go round by round, identifying some of our favorite picks that we see in each round. So let's kick things off by talking a little bit about draft position. Dan, I want to hear about what your favorite drafting position is. And if you don't get that drafting position, sort of like what's like your next favorite?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of an advantage to getting one of those top 4 or 5 running backs, depending on how you feel about David Johnson. And I actually think there's a little bit of an advantage at the 3 or 4 spot because there is for me at least, there's a little bit of a drop off once you get to like 22 or so. And if the guys kind of go straight by ADP, sometimes if I'm drafting first or second, I'm kind of looking at the options there and I'm not super excited about any of them in the second round. So for me, the sweet spot's like 3rd or 4th is my favorite draft position this year.
Nice. David, would you agree with that take?
I prefer being 1 or 2. 1 or 2 is outstanding, and you lock down that key running back and then literally could just kind of go let the rest of the draft come to you. If it doesn't happen and you don't start necessarily with running backs, I prefer being somewhere in the middle just so that I can control and hope to get value every round. Doesn't always work that way, but that's the plan, at least be in the middle to control how that goes.
Yeah. James.
Sorry. I was going to ask David, do you have a big gap where you say like, do you think there's a big gap between 1 and 2 and like 3 and 4 at running back? Is that why you prefer that?
I do. Well, I think Zeke is an unknown situation now. So is he 3, 4? That's tricky. And then Alvin Kamara, I feel like it's still more of I love him as a player, but he's more of a gadget player and could work in best ball. But I think there's going to be weeks that he just doesn't do that much. Like I think Latavius Murray could have big weeks in that offense. So Barkley, Christian McCaffrey, I think are a clear 1-2 at running back this year.
Yeah, that's probably where we're different because Kamara is actually my number 1 guy this year.
Okay, so you love 3 because you get him at 3, right? That makes total sense.
Why I'm kind of into it.
There you go. James, what's your take on draft position here?
Yeah, if I get a top 3, I'm pretty happy. I think they're Barkley, McCaffrey, and Kamara. They're all safe, and even if I get a top 5, I'm still pretty happy. And it's either Zeke or David Johnson. So you're not gonna be mad about that. But basically, I've done so many drafts that doesn't really matter. Just come whatever, and then it kind of helps with the construction too. So you can kind of just construct different teams. So it's all fun. But if I had to pick, top 3.
Right on. David, I'll pitch it to you. Let's move on to talking about round 1. We kind of talked a little bit about running backs here. What about wide receivers? Let's say you don't have a top 5 pick. What does your round 1 end up looking like?
Yeah, I think the ADP is pretty much dead on. I've got Devontae Adams a bit lower than probably most, so he's somebody I don't end up with a lot, but I love Hopkins. I actually love Tyreek Hill in the end of the first round, but he mostly goes in the second round. So I've got my order, Hopkins, Jones, Adams, Hill, and I generally end up with one of those guys.
Yeah. Dan, what's your take on receivers in the first round?
Yeah, I'm kind of with David. I like those guys at the end. I'm a little bit higher on Odell Beckham than I think it sounds like he is, just because we have no idea what that's going to look like in Cleveland. We don't know how big of a leap Baker Mayfield's going to make. And I like that unknown, especially in tournaments, just because if it hits, it could be really big. So right. Beckham's actually my 3rd wide receiver, and he's a guy, if I'm picking 10th or 11th, he's kind of the guy I've been ending up with lately in the end of the first round.
Yeah. James, what's your wide receiver outlook?
Yeah, I'm fine with if I get Adams or Hopkins, I'm pretty happy. And then Julio, I think's great. Beckham, I like, but there's so many targets in Cleveland. It feels like there's just so much talent on the offense. So I'll take him 4th out of those 4.
Yeah. Oh, so. David, I want to ask you about tight end in the first round. You're not a fan of drafting a tight end in the first round, right?
No, I've got Kelsey like somewhere between 13 and 14, but I don't think I've had a single draft yet that he's went that far. So,
yeah.
I mean, if I get him, it would be at 13 or 14. That's where I feel like there's value, and he's always gone before then. He's usually gone by pick 7, 8 at the latest. When other people don't like him, he's picked way before I would get him.
Yeah, his value took a hit with Tyreek Hill, no suspension. So, but before that news, yeah, he was a pretty solid late first round pick, in my opinion. But yeah, now he's kind of slipping to early second for me.
Yeah. Dan, let's talk about round 2. What are you looking at here?
So it kind of depends on draft position. I like going wide receiver if I'm drafting late. So if I can get like Odell Beckham, Michael Thomas, or something like that. And part of the reason is there's some really nice running back options that I know for sure are going to be there in the late third, early fourth. So I do like going wide receiver early second there with guys like Juju. Tyreek Hill is usually there in the second, sometimes Michael Thomas. If I'm drafting later, my favorite running back is Damian Williams. He's a guy who in the second round I've been ending up with more than anyone else. And it's really just all about that Chiefs offense. They just score so many touchdowns. Their running back scored 25 touchdowns last year. Williams had, when you include the playoffs, he had 10 touchdowns in 6 games. And you just can't get that type of upside, touchdown upside with most of those other guys, maybe Gurley. But other than that, like Joe Mixon and the Bengals aren't going to score a ton of touchdowns. I mean, I think that they have 19 running back touchdowns over the last 2 years. So they're not even touching the Chiefs, what they did just last year. So for me, I'm kind of swinging for the fences on Damian Williams and hoping that he's going to get 80% of the snaps and kind of pick up right where Kareem Hunt left off. I think he's going to be just as good. So he's my second round guy.
Nice. James, it kind of depends on where you're drafting from and how your first couple of rounds go, but how does that fold into your third round if, based on kind of where you're coming through the first 2?
Okay, yeah, third round. Let's see where I'm at. T.Y. Hilton's he's my smash in the third round. I take him almost. He's one of my highest owned. I just like the schedule. I just kind of think the yardage is this year. So he's my go-to. If I don't get Hilton, I'll go with Amari Cooper. So those are my 2 kind of go-to in the third round. As far as running backs, I like in that round. Marlon Mack, if he's available, sometimes he'll go in the second, but and Kerryon Johnson, he's been moving up. I think there's going to be some usage there for him, and he could be in line for like a top 5 season, top 10 in that mix. So I like him as well. I'm passing on guys like Devontae Freeman and Leonard Fournette right now. They're kind of 2 of my avoids, so I'd rather look to like Marlon Mack, Aaron Jones, Kerryon Johnson, even Derrick Henry and Josh Jacobs is kind of sneaking up as well. So yeah, there's the third round's great, so there's can't go wrong, I don't think.
Nice. I think it's good that you mentioned your fades there because I think especially in these early rounds, the ADP is like, well, yeah, duh, you're going to take that guy in the third round. But if there's a guy you're avoiding in the third round, I think that's super helpful for people to think about. David, let's talk about the fourth round a little bit. In one of our earlier episodes, we talked about how we kind of like ignore quarterbacks and tight ends until maybe like round 8 or even 9. But this is the point where you start to see a few tight ends are already off the board. You might see Patrick Mahomes come off the board, round 3, round 4. Is there any way that one of these guys could fall far enough that you would pay attention to a tight end or a quarterback by round 4?
Yeah, Ertz and Kittle are gone. They're gone.
Yeah.
By early round 3. So no tight end should really be on the board. Mahomes sometimes slides into the 4th, but he's off my radar until the 5th, so I never get him either.
Yeah.
And then the one guy, the biggest avoid for me is David Montgomery. He's a clear avoid. He's going in the 4th round. He's somebody I think I have 0% rostered in favor of Mike Davis and some Tariq Cohen. And we'll see. I could be just heavily wrong on that, but that's somebody I'm avoiding. Also avoiding Mark Ingram. AJ Green kind of was going in this 4th round. I avoid him there. But I'm looking for guys that we really – the Chris Godwins, the Julian Edelmans, if I'm going receiver. And then just there's a lot of times, a lot of this 3rd round running back talent, Leonard Fournette, Derrick Henry, some of those guys all slide into like an early 4th round pick. So I look for some of the value to slide there as well. But mostly I want, again, high-powered offenses, either a real stellar receiver or a solid running back.
No, I think the fourth round is probably the worst round. It's the hardest. Every time I get to the fourth round, it's a hard decision there. So, I mean, I don't know if everyone else feels the same way.
I think it's the reason Mahomes goes right around there. He goes like at 34 to 37 because everybody's like, well, these guys all look about the same. I think I'll just take. But I think, again, you're starting 3 receivers every week plus a flex. If you don't start loading up on receivers, you're going to find yourself pretty far behind the curve. So getting guys like Brandon Cooks, Julian Edelman, Chris Godwin, Kenny Golladay, those are guys that Tyler Lockett, those are guys you kind of need to build out your roster to be competitive.
Yeah, but they still feel expensive for the fourth round. I think that's kind of, I don't know. They seem like they should be 5th round picks maybe. That's kind of where I get them.
Yep. Dan, do you have that sort of dread coming into the 4th round, or how do you feel about the 5th round?
Yeah, well, 4th round for me, there's a drop off. I'm in on Chris Godwin. He's kind of the last of the guys who feel like a 4th rounder to me, and he usually falls into kind of the mid to late 4th. I feel good about him. If not, then yeah, I agree with James. You're kind of trying to pick which of the 3 Rams receivers, and it's a different guy every week. They don't necessarily feel like 4th rounders. Kind of that 5th, 6th round range. I love there's just a lot of wide receivers. I mean, especially into the 6th where you got Christian Kirk, Allen Robinson, Tyler Boyd, Robbie Anderson, all these guys, Mike Williams, Calvin Ridley. To me, that's the kind of where I'm filling out the meat of my wide receiver core. I'm trying to get 1 or 2 wide receivers early, and then really just loading up in that 4th through 6th round range so that I have 4 or 5 of those guys and I have depth, and I feel like really good about having some upside too. So 4th to 6th round to me is the wide receivers round, and then I kind of come back with there's some running backs I like in that 7th, 8th round range. So I feel like I can start taking some chances on running backs if I really strengthen my wide receiver core in that 4th through 6th round range.
Is there a receiver that you see come off the board in round 5 and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that guy is taken because I had 0 interest in that guy? Like that kind of commonly gets taken in the 5th round?
I'm a little bit leery of Calvin Ridley. Like, I get it. But the Atlanta offense it felt like they had their best season last year. Matt Ryan finished quarterback too. There's not a whole lot more upside there. And that there's so many guys vying for targets just because they're all back. So he only had 94 targets last year. I could see him getting a few more, but I'm trying not to draft a guy who I'm projecting for like 100, 105 targets right there in the 5th round when just a few picks before I see somebody like Godwin who could realistically get 130, 140. So he's the guy who I see the upside, and if something happens to Julio, he could go nuts, but he's a guy who I just don't see enough volume. So he's one where I kind of smile if somebody drafts him and somebody I like a little better falls.
Yeah. Let's see. Keeping going around the horn here. James, let's talk about 6th round. Who are you looking at here in the 6th, and who are you glad when someone else takes them?
6th round for sure is wide receivers. Just looking at current ADP on draft, this is the 6th round. You got Tyler Boyd, Allen Robinson, Robbie Anderson, Christian Kirk, Alshon Jeffrey, Jarvis Landry, and then just outside you got Dante Pettis and Will Fuller. So I mean, it's just loaded. If you wanted to go running back, you're looking at Tariq Cohen, Tevin Coleman, Rashad Penny. So I think it's just you're looking for whatever is your favorite receiver in that round. Sometimes you can get those receivers in the 7th round too, so you can get 2 of them, which is great.
Nice. So it sounds like if you're seeing someone take like a quarterback in this round or one of those kind of like meh running backs, you're like, cool, more receivers for me.
No, that's exactly. And Cooper Kupp's the one I always like to see go in the 5th or 6th when I don't take him.
Nice. Nice. So we made it through the first 6 rounds of the draft here. So kind of looking back a little bit at this, we're going to get to the other rounds, but when you get to this point, what, David, do you feel good about when you look at your roster? Are you like, dude, I got 3 running backs and 3 receivers, I'm feeling good? Like, what are you looking for after?
Yeah, Again, my main thing is by the 8th round, I would love to have 4 running backs and 4 receivers. So almost always 7 and 8 are the corrective rounds for me. So I don't care if I went 1, 4, and now I'm left, or I've got 2 receivers and 4 running backs, or 4 receiver. It doesn't really matter how the mix is. I'm just looking at using those 2 rounds generally to get right. Now, obviously, if exceptional value goes in other positions, sometimes you just still have to break your normal mode. But I generally want to be back to square at 8, because again, when I start looking at quarterbacks and tight ends, I don't want to see all this value sliding by that I have to take and get off my normal game plan of drafting. So generally I use around 7 and 8 to kind of correct back as long as there's good value there. And there generally is around 7 and 8. And a lot of picks in around 7 and 8 too is like, even though this is their ADP, a lot of these guys will slide a good rounder, 10 picks or so from that ADP. So just a lot of times, some of these guys like should have been gone in the 6th. You'll be picking up, mid 7th. And that's kind of how you get, variation in your rosters.
Yeah, totally. James, what do you think about in terms of bye weeks, or do you think about bye weeks at all here?
I mean, I do. So just like David, when he's going 4 and 4, I'm kind of the similar. So sometimes I'll go 3 and 5 or 5 and 3 to start out the gate. But I am looking at bye weeks, especially on those rounds players, just because. I don't know. I don't want to be hit one week with. I just want to score as many points every week. So I'm looking at any edge I can, and maybe it's only the smallest of edges, but I'm going to use it to my advantage. If it's between 2 players that I have ranked the same, I'm going to take the one that I don't already have a bye week the same. So it's just like a little bit of a just a win, kind of moves my ranks up just because of that. So. But
yeah. So Dan, looking ahead to the 2nd third of the draft, you're walking out of the 1st third, you're feeling good, your game plan's going well. What are you sort of focused on for this sort of 2nd third of the draft, round 7 through 12?
Yeah, so there's some fun young running backs, especially in tournaments that I'm on in the 7th, 8th round, where you can get like a Miles Sanders. Sometimes Rashad Penny's falling down there. I'm kind of worried about the Washington offense, but I'm still pretty intrigued by Darius Geis, just because he's the type of guy who it looks really crowded right now with Adrian Peterson and some of that, but he could be kind of like Nick Chubb last year, where he's just too good for them to not give it to him 15, 20 times a game. And then Curtis Samuel, I've mentioned before, is kind of my go-to wide receiver in the 8th round if he's still there. Then once you get past the 8th round, there's kind of a drop-off, I think, both at running back and wide receiver, where at wide receiver, I feel like some of the upside, there's not a ton of upside once you get past like the 8th or 9th round. And at running back, there's some upside, but there's just no floor at all. There's just guys who really swinging for the fences on, you might not get anything. So there is kind of like, once you get in that 8th round, I feel like there's a little bit of a drop-off at those positions, which is like these other guys have been saying, if you get stuck with only 1 or 2 wide receivers and you get in that 9th round and you feel like you have to chase wide receiver, the options are pretty bad. So I kind of agree with them on loading up on running backs, wide receivers early. There are some, if a tight end falls or whatever, I will take it. You don't have to do 4 and 4, but I think you do want at least 3 wide receivers, 3 running backs when you get to the, by the time you're in the 9th round.
Yeah. James, I want to look back just a little bit here. There's a couple of guys with sort of unknown situations. I want to make sure we cover them. What do you do with AJ Green? Where is his ADP now, and how does that compare to sort of like what you're thinking in terms of where you may or may not take him?
Sure. His ADP right now is like the end of the 4th, 5th round. He's kind of moving that direction. Yeah, I mean, as far as AJ Green, you want, maybe if you're playing a regular best ball, you value him differently than if you're playing the championship. If you're playing a regular, maybe it's safer to pass on him and let someone else grab him, and then you go Tyler Boyd like a round later. So that way you're getting production every single week. If you're playing those championships on draft, you might want to have AJ Green end of the season to kind of push you over the top.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
David,
go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say, ask David about Melvin Gordon because he's a little bit of a wild card here. Where do you think his ADP is right now, and where do you have him?
Yeah, his ADP is right at the end of round 2.
Yeah.
I think right now, I think the clarity is horrible. I mean, it's clear to me that the Chargers really don't want to pay him because they have 2 outstanding backs behind him that are min salaried. So I think they know they don't want a 5-year contract with Melvin Gordon. They've used him up a bunch. They'd love him to come in and play for his $5.5 million. I think there's even some chance they would potentially franchise him for the $12 million. So they wouldn't mind like a 2-year deal at $20 million total. I think Gordon is also looking and saying, wow, I want a 5-year deal. So they're so far apart. I think this could really, really sour. I'm, for the most part, avoiding Melvin Gordon. If anything, I've got Austin Ekeler and Justin Jackson a lot higher on my boards and looking to grab them in a lot of shares. So he's going at the end of round 2. For me, I don't even really consider him until the 3rd round. Now, in the championship thing, he's around there in the 3rd round. He could be an absolute difference maker if he does show up on day 1 and might be worth a swing for the fences. But he's someone I'm mostly on the avoid list right now.
Yeah. Are there any other sort of like controversial players at the moment? Those seem like the 2 big ones right now to me. And then, is there another one you had in mind?
I mean, you could throw Kareem Hunt and Chris Herndon, like those are 2 names
Injured.
that kind of stick out.
Yeah.
They're both suspended.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. David, we heard some of Dan's sort of 7th, 8th round picks, and in the previous show, we sort of talked about we're still looking at running backs and receivers generally in this territory. What's your take, kind of on the 7th, 8th round?
Yeah, same thing. Corey Davis is a guy I end up with a lot who I grade out a lot higher, and he almost always follows to me in the 8th. He's somebody I like to get. Again, not that super exciting for a Tennessee offense, but I think he's their clear number 1 on that team. But it's the same thing. I mean, you're swinging either wide receiver 1s on bad offenses or wide receiver 2s, 3s on good offenses, and that never feels super good. So I'm in agreement with Dan. When you start taking shots at Miles Sanders, Royce Freeman, Darius Geis, those are the kind of guys I'd rather swing and get potentially a home run hitter here than to get just some kind of middle of the road player.
Yeah. Let's talk about round 9, 10, James. What are some of the guys that you avoid at that point, and what are some guys you're seeing high ownership for around round 9, 10?
That's usually round 9. I'm looking to fill in my tight end usually. So it's round 8 and 9, 10. I'm kind of looking at tight end, kind of thinking about quarterback going forward after that.
Mm-hmm.
So some of my, like the 9th, Austin Hooper is a nice pick, I think, or Carson Wentz. I don't mind as going for my first quarterback. As far as like the receiver, you got D.D. Westbrook, Cortland Sutton, but I'm not like in love with those guys. Then some of my avoids, like I'm off Larry Fitzgerald. Drew Brees, I think, is a little too expensive. Ronald Jones is just don't know the situation. Kareem Hunt's going in the 10th. LaShawn McCoy, Peyton Barber. So somebody's probably going to get a bargain with one of those Tampa running backs, but I can't take a chance on one of them. So,
Dan, do you disagree on any of those takes on that James is mentioning? Any of those guys you're taking a chance on?
Yeah, I like Larry Fitzgerald, but I'm buying all things Arizona.
I like Larry Fitzgerald, yes.
As a person.
Yeah. But not like he's a guy, especially like he's somebody who's actually moved up my board in the last week or two, because it just seems like all the reports from Arizona training camp are just like Murray to Fitz. So he's a guy who I think is kind of interesting. He's actually part of the reason I like him is his ADP is right around 100. And for me, like I said, there's kind of a cliff there after 100 where I'm just not in on any of those other wide receivers. Or at least I don't see a difference between the guys going 100 and the guys going 130. So I take a couple rounds off there, and that's where I'm getting. I think you get 2 quarterback ones there, and it's only costing you like a 9th, 10th, 11th rounder. I'm fine with going quarterback back-to-back in like the 10th and 11th or 9th and 11th, something like that. So I'm kind of avoiding a lot of those. He mentioned some of the guys like Cortland Sutton and some of those guys. I might like Emmanuel Sanders just as much, or maybe even a little more in the 12th or 13th round. So I'm kind of passing on those guys and really trying to get my quarterback. The other one, I'm not quite as in on Austin Hooper this year. I just don't feel like there's a ton of upside there, and I don't feel like he's that much better. And he might have a little bit higher floor, but I don't think he's that much better than some of the guys going in like the 12th or 13th round. So he's a guy I've actually been passing on.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's talk about the final third of the draft. We've it sounds like that sort of middle third, you're picking up a quarterback or two, you're picking up a tight end. When you look back at your sort of roster construction, David, at this point through 12 picks, what are you feeling good about having in terms of your sort of positional breakdown?
Yeah, most of the time I have generally 2 quarterbacks, 5 running backs, and 5 receivers, heading into 12. So again, if I could get Hooper, I try to get Hooper and Kyle Rudolph every time. So in some rosters I'll have a tight end. If not, I wait super late. But yeah, hopefully I don't feel like I have glaring holes at running back or receiver. So to me, this is just almost all about the value game and kind of seeing what falls and slides. And that's what's beautiful about these things is this is when ADP really starts to get, I think, really off from what, at least my own draft board looks like and how I'm projecting guys. Guys like Jerick McKinnon, I have as having a lot bigger role than his ADP of 137. Guys like Emmanuel Sanders is all the way up to 91 on my individual board. He's going at 142. So you're able to just slot some of these absolute stellar guys that I'm looking to have on a whole series of my rosters. Jack Doyle, who might actually be the starting tight end in Indianapolis, he's going at 155. So you start getting late in the game. It's mostly all about value now for me on guys that are just substantially different than ADP on my board, at least.
Yeah, and it feels like, if you're in like a 12-team league, it kind of depends on how those people drafted their first 12 picks. It's going to slide certain positions higher or lower and really, mess with ADP. It's not going to be like sort of a standard pattern through these last 6 rounds. I hear the term like upside thrown around a lot, like when you get to sort of these later rounds in the draft. James, how do you think about actually, let me pitch it to Dan. Dan, how do you think about upside at this point? Are you willing to take a guy that has like low floor and high upside the further you get into the draft?
I think upside can like look different. Sometimes there's upside where you don't necessarily see it. Some of the veteran wide receivers, we talked about Emmanuel Sanders, Tyrell Williams is another guy. There's actually some good upside in that 12th, 13th round at wide receiver, where part of what I'm doing is just trying to fill in these guys who can have big weeks. Yeah. Where, like Tyrell Williams, he loves catching long touchdowns. So he might not have 1,200-yard upside on the season, but on a week-to-week basis, he's a guy who can go for 20 points. So I'm kind of filling it in that way. At running back, part of my big focus, we talked about this a little bit, is I'm trying to avoid guys who their upside is part of a committee where there's like, kind of like the LaShawn McCoy in Buffalo. It just feels like they're going to use 3 guys. So nobody's going to bust out huge. Where I'm looking at maybe somebody like Alexander Madison is one of the guys I've been targeting around the 14th round. He's backing up Dalvin Cook. And Dalvin Cook's been injured a lot. And I feel like he's one of those guys who, if Dalvin Cook goes down, it's not going to be a 3-man committee. It's going to be 18, 20 touches for Alexander Madison. And I know there's some people maybe disagree on that, but that's kind of how the read I have on that situation. So especially in tournaments, those are the kind of guys I'm targeting where maybe there's not a ton of upside just right now, but if you only need one thing to happen, and especially if it's somebody like Dalvin Cook, who he's been injured like 3 straight years going back to college, it's not crazy to think, you show up in week 10 and Alexander Madison's a top 10 running back. So those are the kind of guys I'm kind of looking at in terms of upside.
Yeah. James, I want to ask you, how much do you think about handcuffs at this point? You've made it through the first 12 rounds. You've got, a few running backs you're feeling good about. Are there some like late round handcuffs that you tend to have ownership of?
So the way I look at handcuffs, I don't want to handcuff my own running backs, but I will take other people's handcuffs so guys that I like for that. I like like I said earlier, I was off Devontae Freeman. He's one of my fades. So I like going Ito Smith, and he's like a 12th, 13th rounder where he's going to be the running back 5 on my team or running. So, I mean, there's nothing to lose really with that because I feel like the position's already taken care of on my team. And if he goes off, he can – I mean, he's going to be great if he gets the starting role. But even if he doesn't, he could steal touchdowns along the way, and maybe he still gets 35% of the touches or whatever. So in best ball, that's all those kind of guys you're looking for where, like we've talked about Chicago, where they have 3 running backs. But if you can find a team that has just 2 running backs and the splits are closer to 60-40 or 50-50, like you can get some good value on some of these running backs. And like Kalen Ballage is a name now that's kind of heading in that direction. Naheem Hines, like he gets the receiving role. So he's always going to score for you, and he's going to have some big weeks for you. Some other guys that I'm looking at, Dan's mentioned Chase Edmonds a bunch of times. Like he's a handcuff, but he gives you potential every week to get a touchdown or to get extra carries or break a long play. So just always looking for those kind of handcuffs. But also there's if you want to look at the wide receivers, I have actually liked to handcuff a few receivers late. Usually it's after when I get 5 receivers. So I'm looking at 6, 7, 8 on my roster. But if I can get like Kenny Stills and Albert Wilson paired together, like to me that pairing's almost as good as like a wide receiver 3. But it takes 2 roster spots, but it doesn't cost you hardly anything. Like Stills is in the 14th round and Albert Wilson's like 15th, 16th. So I like to do different things like that. You can do that with Buffalo and Jacksonville as well. But,
right on. Wide receiver, kind of pairing them up and see which guy has the big game. I mean, with best ball, you're going to get the best of whatever they offer, whatever that pair offers. David, who are some of the guys you tend to draft in rounds like 13 through 15? Like not quite all the way to the dart throws at the end, but like just before.
Yeah. So I'm super big on Derek Carr this year. So again, I'm one of those guys that almost always has 3 quarterbacks. So when that starts getting bleak, I make sure I jump in and get Derek Carr. That can float all the way as round 16, but it can go as early as round 12, just depending on how the drafts kind of go. I love Derek Carr. Then he said essentially career highs in percentage, yardage, and even I think attempts, maybe not attempts, definitely yards, percentage. But his touchdowns were way off. Well, they added Antonio Brown. They added Tyrell Williams. Darren Waller looks like he might be a player. And that's a team that's probably playing from behind in almost every game. So I think people might be sleeping immensely on this Oakland offense. So Derek Carr is a guy at quarterback I'm adding a bunch of. I'm also getting a ton of shares of Giovanni Bernard. And again, that's a situation where both of these guys have talked to. Here's the clear backup to Joe Mixon, who is a first, second round pick. But the reality is Bernard's going to get a bunch of, touches as a third down back along the way. But if Mixon was to get hurt, Bernard could seriously carry the load for 3 or 4 game stretch period, which, if it coincided with the end of the season, would be just fantastic. So guys like that I'm looking at. I try not to go after running backs like a Duke Johnson who has a limited role, but doesn't, even if somehow somebody gets benched, he's not going to have a bigger role. So they've mentioned a lot of the same guys, the Chase Edmonds of the world. That's the kind of players I'm looking for as well that could just could step into that starting role if they get it. A guy that I might be the only guy drafting him, but in the round 18, I have a lot of shares of Gus Edwards, who I'm kind of betting against Mark Ingram, who's 29, got switched off a team. That's just generally a bad sign for me. Like when running backs don't get a second contract, similar to like the Melvin Gordon situation. Not to say they're not good, but it seems like they've seen something that they've moved on as they've approached that age 30. So you can go – most people are saying Justice Hill will get that job. But, I mean, Gus Edwards averaged 5.2 yards per carry in that exact same offense last year. So everybody's overlooking him. So, again, when you want a dart throw in a team it's going to run the ball, give me one of those guys, Justice Hill or Gus Edwards. So, again, similar to kind of what James does, if there's guys I'm betting against, like I'm betting against Ingram, I could be way wrong on that, but since I'm betting against him, I might as well go all in and also take the backup to build that hunch fully.
Yeah. If you're fading one guy, there's some other guy who's probably rising up your chart above ADP.
Right.
Dan, talk to me a little bit about those last 3 rounds. Maybe some of the guys you're getting, you're just getting a lot of late, or guys that you see wouldn't even go drafted unless you were in the draft. Who are these guys you're getting?
So my highest owned guy actually is Tony Pollard. He's just one of those guys who, especially early on, he was always 17th, 18th round. I think he's going to get a little bit more work than people think, even if Zeke's there. They draft him in the 4th round, and he's a good receiver. And Zeke, between the regular season playoffs last year, 433 touches. It's just not sustainable. So I think he's one of those guys who, kind of like Gio Bernard, he's going to have some week-to-week upside. And then you have some injury upside in addition to some holdout upside, because nobody seems real worried about Zeke right now. And I'm not saying there's a high percentage chance that he's going to hold out or anything, but it's just one of those unknowns where it's almost like free upside at this point, because if he's out, they did sign Alfred Morris recently, which I didn't love, but he could be a 60-70% of the snaps guy, Tony Pollard. I still like Darren Waller just because I think he's going to be the number 3 target in that Oakland offense. And, I don't know if it's going to be great, but he's fine as your 2nd or 3rd wide tight end. I'm on Deebo Samuel as another guy who I really like, just because I think the pecking order in San Francisco, people are kind of assuming it's for sure Dante Pettis is the number 1 guy. But, like Pettis and Samuel, they're the same age. They were both early 2nd round picks. Pettis did have like a little bit of a head start because he started 4 or 5 games at the end of last year, but it looks like both those guys are locked into starting roles in the 2 wide receiver sets. So I'm not totally sure why one guy's going in the 6th round and the other guy's going in the 16th. And it's not that I don't like Pettis. It's more just like I think people are sleeping on how big a role Deebo Samuel could have right away. So he's another guy who's really high on my list of ownership. I think he's my highest owned wide receiver just because when he's there in the 16th round, I'm taking him.
Nice. James, I'll pitch the same question to you. Who are the guys that you're looking for really late and probably wouldn't get drafted unless you were there?
So are we talking like 17th, 18th round or like 15th?
Yeah, 16, 17, 18.
16. Yeah. Okay. I like Taylor Gabriel in Chicago. I'm kind of high on the Bears offense. That's why Allen Robinson's one of my highest owned, but even Gabriel, he's like 3rd wide receiver on that team. And I'm looking for wide receiver 7 that can, have those big games. And he's the kind of guy that could, get a 60-yard touchdown just like that. So, and on top of that, he also has a safe floor where he's going to get 5 catches a game and 40 yards, 50 yards, whatever. I think Nelson Aguilar is one of my, so right now he is actually, he's wide receiver 82. so, I mean, he's just an afterthought. He's starting to, maybe some news blurbs come out on him that he's having a good camp. So he's going to start moving up, but just getting him in that offense with Carson Wentz. And I mean, he's showed it in the past. I think he's never finished as below like wide receiver 45. So wide receiver 83 right now. Yeah. So that's someone I'll take a chance on for my 7th wide receiver.
Nice.
Just in the 18th round.
Yeah. David, I'll give you one more shot at this same question.
I got a whole slew of guys.
Tell me a slew of guys.
Yeah, so like Gerald Everett doesn't get drafted in a ton of these, and that's just amazing to me. So all of a sudden, all the receivers for the Rams going rounds 4 through 6 somehow, but their starting tight end doesn't get drafted in round 18. So Gerald Everett's a tight end I end up with a lot by just waiting. You could get Jason Witten a lot of times at the very end of the draft, and he's clearly the starting tight end. Not exciting. I'm not saying this is an exciting play, but again, when everybody else is reaching for tight ends and you're getting these guys at the very end of the draft that have a clear role. Zay Jones, I think, is wide receiver 1 on Buffalo. You're now kind of seeing that. Like a lot of people were drafting Robert Foster above him. I don't believe that's the case. I mean, he's running with the 2s right now. So if Zay Jones continues to run with the 1s, he's the starting wide receiver in Buffalo, and you're getting him in the very last picks of the draft. So again, Josh Allen's going to hit somebody over there. Can you just get awesome production on these guys that are just basically dart throws at the ends? It's funny. All of the Washington players generally seem to fall outside of the draft zone. Like, who's their wide receiver one? Is it Paul Richardson or Josh Doxson? But both generally don't get drafted. So you can take your choice on either one of those guys. And then I even love Chris Thompson as a third down running back. You got Adrian Peterson, who's aging, clearly. And then you got Darius Geis. We're not really sure the health of him. So Chris Thompson might have a way bigger role that you're getting at the very end of the thing. And I've already mentioned before in episode 2, Washington has this unbelievable weeks 14 through 16 strength of schedule. So I know they've got some offensive line issues. The team looks like horrible anyway, but just if something happens to Adrian Peterson or Darius Geis, which doesn't seem that far stretched, Chris Thompson could have a giant role. So just guys like that. David Moore's on my radar late as a player who's already done pretty good damage in Seattle that everybody's kind of forgot about now that DK Metcalf got drafted. So just guys that easily could have big catapulting weeks or potentially giant roles in their offenses, and a lot of times lesser offenses like Buffalo and Washington.
Yeah.
Throw in one name?
Yeah, do it.
Okay. So, I'm not necessarily reaching for guys just for uniqueness. So, for the most part, I'm drafting guys who are getting drafted in most drafts. But if there's a run on all the guys I feel okay about, my random 18th round dart is Alfred Blue. And don't feel great.
Got a ton of them.
I think everyone assumes like Reichwell Armstead, their 5th round draft pick, is going to be the backup. But from everything I've seen, Alfred Blue's the number 2 in Jacksonville, and Armstead's both hurt and didn't sound like he was real impressive in the offseason. And we know like Fournette has had a really hard time staying healthy. He's got the ankle problems. So TJ Yeldon was really productive in relief of Fournette last year. So Blue, he's one of those guys who are like, Alfred Blue, because it's just kind of nothing about his game is like super exciting to draft. But in terms of the situation, he's one of those guys. He's just a professional, and if something happens to Fournette, which could very easily happen with his ankle problems that he's had for 3 straight years, there's nothing else there in Jacksonville. It's just Armstead and Blue, and I think Blue's the guy there. So he's one who, if there's one guy who not anybody's drafting except me late, Alfred Blue is one who on occasion, if everyone else is gone, I'll take.
I'm usually drafting him, Dan. So,
you are?
Yeah. I usually pick him up in the 17th, so I don't even wait till.
Okay, nice.
But
right
yeah.
on.
All right. Well, we're winding down episode 3, but we have this tradition on the Power Grid where we have parting thoughts, words of wisdom that you might offer, anything random to people who are playing on draft, whether it's in a championship or a regular contest. What's one last thought you have to wrap up this draft trilogy? David, I'm going to pitch it to you first. Tell me, what's one parting thought you would give to people who are playing on draft?
Yeah, I think the key for me is, again, I just click off quarterback and tight end. Don't even look at them. Just pound your running backs and wide receivers and click it back on when you get to the 9th. So you're just not tempted to deviate from your plan.
I like it. James, what are your parting thoughts?
I might go in a little bit different direction in this one. Sure. So kind of like we don't talk really about bankroll management maybe in best ball, but I think it's a good idea. Let's just say rough number, you put $100 onto draft and you want to play in their draft championship. So I'd like to do maybe 25% into those championships and then 75% into the year 12-mans, the regular ones, the 10-mans, the 3-mans. It's all about the draft and you want to have that shot. So, but at the end, you want to be able to make money. So that gives you a fair chance to have your shot and to be able to be profitable. So that's kind of how I look at it.
I think that's a good tip. Yeah, a little balance there. Dan, what is your parting thoughts?
My parting thought is at this time of the year especially, the big key to having success in these is making sure you're totally up to date with all the new info before you hop into a draft, because that's where you're going to find your values, especially when we start having these preseason games and you start seeing things where like, oh, you know what, this guy actually played almost all the snaps with the first round or with the first team, and the ADP takes a little while to adjust. That's where you got to kind of find your edge is leverage any information advantage you think you have. And by doing that, one of the great things you can do is check out Footballguys does training camp reports. And I don't think there's anything else like it out there. If you check those out, read them, you're going to have all that up-to-date info. Joe Bryant does a great job doing a summary of it if you don't want to read the whole 30 pages. But, I mean, if you have the time, read the 30 pages. If not, Joe does a great job with the summary. And that's where you're going to start finding, why is this guy going to the 12th round? He should be going to the 9th round. And that's kind of a great way to get an advantage, especially this time of year when everyone else is the ADP starts moving slower than it should, because it takes a little while for the information to sink in for everyone. So if you can get that information and act on it right away, that's your edge at this time of year.
I love it. And those training camp reports are like an encyclopedia of information. You definitely want to check those out. The first one is actually free. So when we launch that, be sure to check it out. You can find the training camp reports and all of our other content over at footballguys.com. We have best ball articles, subscription deals. Be sure to check that out. Big thank you to David Dodds, Dan Hindrey, and James Brimacombe for sharing their knowledge on draft best ball. If you missed show number 1 in this trilogy, click on the video in front of James' face to hear the position-by-position breakdown of some of our key picks. If you want to go back to episode 2 and didn't miss that one, be sure to click on Dan's face to go back to that, breakdown of the $3.5 million championship. And to subscribe to our YouTube channel, be sure to click on the black-eyed Joe in front of David's face. I'm Austin Lee saying thank you for watching, and thanks for being a football guy.